The other guards on the Gara firing range called him the Professor, not out of respect, but because of the cheap reading glasses he wore and the methodical, almost tedious way he approached his weapon. His name was Arjun, a man in his late 40s with a quiet demeanor that was often mistaken for timidity. While the younger, brash commandos of the Royal Palace Guard laughed and showed off with their rapid-fire drills, Arjun would spend minutes just wiping down his rifle, for his movements slow and deliberate. Today was the quarterly proficiency test, and the atmosphere was thick with competitive banter. "Come on, Professor. Try to at least hit the target this time, not the mountain behind it," a young guard named Karen shouted, slapping his thigh. The others roared with laughter. Karen was the star of the unit, fast, loud, and confident. He had just finished a round of rapid fire, shredding the center of his target. He thrived on the attention. Arjun, who was carefully loading his magazine, pressing each round in with a thumb that bore a faint, faded tattoo of a winged dagger, didn't look up. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The range officer, a stern man named Colonel Rathor, watched the scene with a mix of annoyance and curiosity. He had seen Arjun's file, a sparse document that stated he was a transfer from a standard army unit. There were gaps in the service record, on redacted sections that were common for those who had been in sensitive postings. But on the range, Arjun was consistently mediocre. He'd hit the target, but never with the flair or accuracy of the others. The colonel had written him off as a desk jockey who had somehow slipped into the Palace Guard, a unit meant to showcase the country's finest. Arjun finally settled onto the firing mat. He didn't assume the standard prone position. Instead, he adjusted his body, angling it slightly, and his left elbow tucked tight under the rifle, his right knee bent in a way that looked awkward to the onlookers. It wasn't the textbook position they were taught. It was a position designed for extreme stability over long periods, a sniper's position. He adjusted his glasses, which were not for reading, but a specific type of polycarbonate lens that reduced glare and protected his eyes from dust. "Look at him. He's building a bed," another guard joked. "Maybe he's going to take a nap." The jeers continued as Arjun took a deep, slow breath, then let half of it out. He went still. The laughter died down as the other guards, one by one, turned to watch. There was something unnerving about his stillness. He wasn't just aiming, he seemed to be communing with the rifle, becoming a part of the landscape. The crosshairs of his scope, a standard issue piece he had never complained about, rested on the center mass of the target 300 meters away. And he held that breath, that perfect stillness, for an impossibly long time. Then he squeezed the trigger. The crack of the shot was just another sound on the range, but the result was not. A small cheer went up from the guards near the target monitors. "Bullseye! Nice one, Professor," Karan said with a hint of surprise. "Lucky shot." Arjun simply cycled the bolt, ejecting the spent casing. He took another breath and fired again. Bullseye. He fired a third time. And the target monitor flickered. There was a pause. Then a confused murmur rippled through the crowd. The third shot hadn't just hit the bullseye, it had gone through the exact same hole as the second shot. On the digital readout, it registered as a single hit. Colonel Rathor squinted at the screen, then walked over to the target itself. He pulled it down and held it up to the light. There were 3 distinct holes in the paper. 2 of them were perfectly superimposed, creating a single and slightly larger hole. The third, the first shot, was a classic bullseye just a fraction of an inch to the left. The colonel's heart began to beat faster. He looked back at Arjun, who was now calmly unloading his rifle, his face an emotionless mask. The range fell silent. Karan's smirk had vanished. The jokes had died in their throats. Everyone was staring at the man they had ridiculed. Arjun packed his kit into a worn canvas bag, and a bag that had seen far more dust and grit than the pristine lockers back at the barracks. He stood up, nodded politely to the colonel, and began to walk away. The silence was broken by the colonel. "Arjun." "Wait." Arjun stopped, his back to them all. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" the colonel asked, his voice devoid of its usual command, replaced by a quiet awe. Arjun turned slightly, his profile visible against the harsh sun. For a moment, the man who was the professor was gone. In his place was a hard-eyed man who seemed to be looking past them, at a memory only he could see. "Another range," he said, his voice low and even. "A long time ago, in another life." He didn't wait for another question. He just walked away, leaving the guards and the colonel standing in stunned silence, the weight of their misplaced mockery finally settling on their shoulders. Later that day, Colonel Rathore sat in his office, staring at Arjun's file once more. The redacted sections seemed to glow under the desk lamp. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years, a contact in the Military Intelligence Directorate. The conversation was short. The voice on the other end, upon hearing Arjun's name and service number, went silent for a long time. Finally, the voice spoke, heavy with respect. "Rathore, that file is above your pay grade and mine. But off the record, that man isn't a soldier. He's a ghost. He was part of a joint task force, an SAS collaboration. He was one of their best, the best shot I've ever seen. He doesn't miss. He hasn't missed in 20 years. The question isn't how he shot today. The question is why he's been pretending to be mediocre for the last 2 years." The colonel slowly put the phone down, his hand trembling slightly. He looked out his window towards the quiet barracks where Arjun lived. And the man who let others call him professor and laugh at him had once been a shadow in the night, a silent guardian on operations so secret they didn't officially exist. He had held his breath and taken shots that changed the course of covert missions, not for glory, but for the men beside him. The ridicule he faced on the range wasn't an insult to him. It was just the meaningless noise of the world he had left behind. He was there for a quiet life, a peaceful posting near the palace gardens he loved to tend. But today, the ghost had inadvertently shown a flicker of his former self, and the silence he left in his wake was far more powerful than any bullet. The next day, the atmosphere in the guardroom was completely transformed. The boisterous laughter was replaced by a low murmur of hushed conversations. When Arjun walked in for the morning briefing, the room fell instantly silent. Karan, who was leaning against a locker, immediately stood up straight, his face pale. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer an awkward apology, but Arjun just gave him a slight, dismissive nod and walked past him to his locker. He pulled out his notebook, the same one he used to log gardening schedules, and waited for the briefing to start. His quiet demeanor remained, but it was no longer seen as weakness. It was seen as a vast, impenetrable depth. No one dared make a joke. They couldn't meet his eye, ashamed of their own behavior. Arjun, however, seemed utterly indifferent to the change. He hadn't changed. Their perception of him had, and to him, that distinction was meaningless. Colonel Rathore called Arjun into his office. He didn't ask for details about his past. He knew he wouldn't get them. Instead, he offered him a position as an instructor on the range to train the young commandos. Arjun politely but firmly declined. "I'm not a teacher, sir," he said. "I just do." "Now they need to find their own way." The colonel nodded, understanding. "You can't teach instinct, and you can't teach the cold patience that came from years of watching through a scope, waiting for a single moment of clarity." He let the matter drop. Arjun returned to his duties, a palace guard once more. But now, when he walked his post at night, past the fountains and the manicured lawns, the other guards on duty watched him with a new kind of reverence. They saw a lonely figure, a man carrying the invisible weight of a past they couldn't comprehend, finding solace not in the roar of a crowd, but in the quiet whisper of the wind through the palace gardens. A few weeks later, during a high-security visit from a foreign dignitary, the palace's primary security grid experienced a strange, inexplicable glitch. For exactly 4 minutes, all the electronic surveillance in the northeast corner went offline. The tech team scrambled, but the backup systems wouldn't kick in. The panic was about to set in. Colonel Rathor, watching from the command center, suddenly thought of Arjun. He grabbed the radio. "Northeast Post, status report." The radio crackled. "All quiet, sir. No movement." It was the guard on patrol there, but Rathor needed more. "Arjun," he radioed, his voice urgent. "Where are you?" There was a pause. A calm voice replied. "I'm in the Old Oak, sir, east of the main gate. I have a clear view of the northeast corner and the dignitary's route. If anything so much as twitches, I'll see it." Rathor rushed to a window and looked towards the old oak tree, a massive, ancient thing on the palace grounds. He couldn't see anything at first. Then, a slight shift in the shadows halfway up the trunk revealed a shape. Arjun was there, perched on a thick branch, completely invisible, his standard-issue rifle held steady, his body merged with the tree. Then he had seen the blackout before the command center did, and had moved to the optimal vantage point, a position that wasn't in any manual, a spot only someone who thought like a ghost would choose. He hadn't waited for orders. He had simply done what he was trained to do: protect. The 4 minutes passed, the glitch was resolved, and the dignitary passed by safely. No one but the colonel and a few senior officers ever knew how close they had come to a potential security breach. They also knew that the breach had been filled, not by technology, but by a quiet man in cheap glasses, sitting in an oak tree, watching the world through the eyes of a predator. The incident cemented a silent truce between Arjun and the unit. He never spoke of his past, and they never asked. He became a sort of quiet legend, a living, breathing secret among them. When the younger guards had trouble with long-range shots, they would sometimes glance over at him, hoping for a hint. And he never offered advice, but occasionally they would find their rifles subtly adjusted in the armory, the sights zeroed to perfection, the bolts cleaned with a meticulous care they couldn't match. They knew it was him. It was his way of teaching without words, of passing on a sliver of his skill without breaking his own code of silence. He remained the professor to them, but now the title was spoken with a profound, unshakable respect. He was the man who had been to the mountain and back, and had chosen to live in its shadow, finding a peace that most soldiers only dream of, guarding a palace and its gardens, far from the battlefields where he had once been a king.